Welcome to episode 5 of Mental Mastery, where I interview the world's greatest minds on what it takes to live a happy and successful life. I'm your host, Max Weigand. On today's show, I'm joined by Dr. Orin Davis, who is a self-actualization engineer, consultant, and principal investigator of the Quality of Life Laboratory, which focuses on topics such as flow, creativity, and performance. In addition, Dr. Davis is the first person in history to receive his PhD in positive psychology and has worked under the guidance of world-famous psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. So, Dr. Oris, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me. Fun to be here.
It's really amazing. So the first thing that really piqued my interest is what I mentioned before. You're the first person to receive the PhD in positive psychology. So what's the story behind that?
So I wanted to do my doctorate with Csikszentmihalyi, and originally I was going to go to Claremont and do my PhD in social psych, but I really wanted to study positive psych with Csikszentmihalyi. Those who know him well call him Mike. So I talked to Mike about it, and they were starting the positive psych program, and I said, okay, that sounds cool. I can focus entirely on positive psychology. I was very enamored of humanistic psychology before I joined. And positive psychology is basically just humanistic psychology with another label. So same stuff, the thing I'm very interested in, studying under one of the masters of the field, and I said, sure, let me do that. I'll focus on
sounds amazing, yeah.
his courses and, all the focus on positive psych. And, still in all, I'm a sociocognitive psychologist who just applies that to, positive psychology and organizational behavior, and like doing that combination seemed really interesting to me. And, that was kind of what made me go to Claremont. I remember, when I got the acceptance, I called Mike and I said, I'm only coming if I can work with you. And he said, sure. So that's where it began, and I was happy to follow him there to Claremont. I really enjoyed working with him. It was an amazing experience working both with him and with Gene Nakamura, who interestingly enough was a former student of his who then became my advisor as well.
Oh, wow.
And so working with, and they're a great pair and so different in so many ways that they complemented each other fantastically. So I learned so much from Mike, and I learned so much from Gene, and what's interesting is how different that all was, and it was an amazing experience.
Yeah, it sounds like you definitely had fun and learned obviously a lot from obviously the masters of psychology and flow. So that's really amazing. Now you focused your PhD thesis on a concept called microflow. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. Microflow was something that Csikszentmihalyi mentioned in a couple random places in his later works. I think once in 2002. But really, he only delved into it in Beyond Boredom and Anxiety in his 1975 book. And I looked at all this, and I said, this does not make sense. I don't understand this microflow thing. I'm kind of curious about it. And what I realized was nobody had ever really done anything on this. And the thing that didn't make sense was, like, what's microflow when you think about the fact that the way it had been defined in 1975 seemed to have been obviated by the work that came later. So I went to Mike and discussed this with him, and what he basically pointed out to me was that most of my arguments weren't very good at the time, okay. Which is the purview of your advisor, and I thought was something I really appreciated from Mike, is that he would tell me that, and he really pushed me to pretty much rebuild the theory from the ground up.
Wow.
As to what microflow should be, and one of the questions that often comes up about flow is, what exactly is flow? A lot of people like to treat flow as a state. It's really not a state. Flow is an experience. As a matter of fact, it's a dynamic and a very chaotic experience. And once you start seeing flow as a dynamic and chaotic experience, you start to see the possibility that there might be degrees of flow, that there might be a deeper flow experience. There might be, for lack of a better term, a more shallow flow experience. And I started wondering if the shallow flow experience was really what microflow was all about. But then what would that be? And I got the idea that maybe some of the characteristics of flow are just somewhat compromised in a microflow experience, that you can't quite experience flow as fully or as deeply. And some of my preliminary work in the dissertation kind of confirmed that. There are a number of limitations to the work. That's one of the reasons why I haven't published it yet. I've been running a number of other studies, still trying to get a handle on what exactly is going on here. hopefully presenting some of that next week at the European Conference on Positive Psych.
Oh, wow.
And hoping that we can really pin down what exactly happens when optimal experience gets compromised just a little bit. Does it completely disappear, or do we have an optimal experience under suboptimal conditions? And is that possible? And that's really where the microflow experiences and experiments came into, was the question, what is the most optimal experience under suboptimal conditions? Usually when you engage in flow, you've got all the right stuff for it. You've got the right context, you've got the right materials, you've got enough time, you're in the right headspace. But what if you're not? Then what analog of flow can you get? And my theory was microflow. And really, this is the question of how do you make the most of your time?
So do you think that's something we can actually consciously create, or that we can seek out, or we can create like the conditions for? Or is that something that just kind of happens when we're in a certain situation, in a certain headspace? What do you think about that?
So flow is, first of all, flow is an emergent phenomenon. So the idea that people can intentionally create flow, not at all. But that said, what you can do is there are a number of variables that will be within your control. And when you work with those particular variables, when you work with all the variables related to flow that are within your control, you increase the likelihood very significantly that you will experience flow. And if you increase that likelihood enough, you really can create a bit of a tipping point where it's likely you're going to go into flow. But I do have to emphasize that just because you've made it likely that you're going to go into flow, that's not a guarantee. And you know, I hear people talking about like what's a guaranteed way to get into flow? There isn't one, nor will there be one.
That is so interesting.
Pull that off with an emergent phenomenon.
Yeah, I love that. And I mean, for me, actually one of the best triggers that I found is running in the rain. Like whenever I go outside and it's raining and I run, I like most of the time, so like you said, it's not always a surefire way, but most of the times I actually get into this flow state. So what are some other triggers that we can use maybe to get us, or to try to get us into this state?
So the notion of a trigger is one of the things that I find problematic. You don't trigger flow.
Okay.
And you know, flow being something emergent, once again, it's not something you trigger. You trigger a state. And don't get me wrong, we can certainly trigger certain states that are consistent with flow, but that we can only get that far. We can trigger ourselves to focus, which is a really important thing and is a big challenge for a lot of people. So that part is the trigger. We can trigger focus, but that doesn't create intrinsic motivation. It doesn't necessarily create the clear goals or feedback system that helps us know that we're actually experiencing those goals. And yet those are often things that we can create.
Wow, that is interesting way of looking at it. Okay, so you study a lot of different things, right? You study performance, you study creativity. So what are some insights that you can share with people on how can we optimize our lives? How can we make sure that we get the most of our lives every single day?
So I think that the most important bit of information I can give people, and what I found is one of the most important rules of positive psychology, really just goes back to temet nosce, know thyself.
Wow.
And so I find that over and over again, like one of the keys that unlocks almost all the benefits of positive psychology is knowing yourself. As one of the things I actually said in my Tedx talk was that, you know, that self-help books are not really written to you or for you because they don't know you. But if you don't know yourself, then you're not going to be able to take advantage of all the advice that's out there. You can't reverse engineer it to who you are. So, you know, you can learn all about flow, what flow is, and all the rest of those things, but you're not going to know which conditions make it more likely for you to get into flow if you don't know what motivates you, or you don't know what's challenging to you, or you don't know what you enjoy doing, or, you know, you don't know where your strengths are. And I mean, you know, each of those tools like strengths or passions or all these things, they begin with self-knowledge.
So what does that reverse engineering process look like? Like, if you know that, like, you wanna feel a certain way, what does it look like of getting to know yourself? Like, is there a certain set of questions that you can ask yourself? Like, how can you How can you like get to know yourself on like at this deep level?
So I want to preface this by saying I'm answering this one anecdotally because I haven't seen so much research on this that I find is helpful. But I mean, there's a little bit, but most of it is really just doing, you know, the inquisitions, finding out like what is my culture, what are my values, like what are the things that I consider to be important. And along those lines, and this may sound a little bit silly, but stay with me on this. One of the first things that I tell people to look at is what are your preferences? Those little preferences. I'm talking about little things like whether you prefer, you know, iceberg lettuce or romaine lettuce in your salad, whether you like green peppers or red peppers, or whether you like, you know, Euro techno or American techno, or, you know, whether you like Brahms or Stravinsky, or like, you know, any number of other pieces out there.
So did you just kind of tell yourself like every single little bit matters, or why do you look at like those really teeny tiny things?
Because they're often things that you can be certain are your preferences. And, you know, I found many people, especially, you know, I teach college and MBA students, many of them are struggling to find out their own identities, especially when they come from very strong cultures with strong familial cultures. And they often find themselves sometimes getting a little lost in the noise. And as a consequence of this, what they can do is begin to see just what are their own little preferences. And those little preferences add up to a really big pattern. Finding out all of our little likes and dislikes, we can begin to look for patterns in that. You know, for instance, as you look through your musical taste, right, the songs you really like, or what your playlist is under different conditions. And, you know, I, as a DJ, as somebody who really loves, you know, modern music and pop music, I say, you know, show me a person's playlist and I can show you what that person's like. You know, for some people, it's looking in the medicine chest. For some people, it's, you know, looking in their backpacks. I look at your playlist. But when you see the patterns across your playlist, like you start to see like how you want music, how you want to experience music, what kinds of feelings you want to have when you listen to music, what you use music for, your interaction with the arts, how and why you value the arts. Even the paintings you like, again, why do you like them? What does that say about your values and the emotions that you like experiencing? And by the way, you know, everybody says, well, everybody wants to experience positive emotions. We do, but which ones? Why those? What do we value? How do people volunteer? How do folks help others? What does that say about their particular values? Which things they find important? All of those add up to creating an individual persona and an identity that we begin to understand. And once we have that identity, we can sort of understand not just what we like, but then we can look at how what we like influences what we do, how what we do influences what we are, and likewise how who we are influences what we like and what we do, and, you know, keep building that up and into a level of self-understanding that we can then apply and use to take all of these suggestions and ideas that come from the positive psychology community and figure out exactly how they fit into our lives, values, preferences, things like that.
That is such an interesting concept, because I think most of us are really aware of like those kind of higher level concepts, right? Like grit or self-discipline or the kind of habits we have, but no one really looks at like the teeny tiny stuff that you mentioned. So that's a really interesting point to kind of look at really the whole picture of your whole human being, right? Look at like everything that, all the preferences, all the what you like, what you do, all of that stuff. That is so interesting. So before that, you mentioned that like oftentimes self-help books and videos and all that stuff aren't that helpful because they aren't like very personal. So how can we as content creators, I mean, that's what we're doing right now, right? With this podcast, we're creating content. How can we fix that? Do you think there's any way that we can tailor it more specifically?
I don't think so. I mean, for instance, I don't know your listeners, so I don't know any of them individually, but I can tell you that each of them would probably find a different way to apply the information I've provided. Often what I would suggest is to do things that are more content free. Come up with, let's say, the meta skills that people should learn, what they should learn how to do. So for instance, instead of telling people, you know, go to bed early, you know, and wake up early, or, you know, early to bed, early to rise makes a person healthy and wise, whatever that is. I mean, instead of just firing aphorisms in their direction. Instead, find out, are you naturally a night owl? Are you naturally a lark? Are you, how does your energy fluctuate throughout the day? What's your cycle like? Do you, how do your eating habits affect your levels of alertness throughout the day? What about your work schedule, the other constraints in your life? Things along those lines. And so you notice that there's a big difference between asking people what to look at in their lives and, sort of providing them with the algorithms, like the if-thens, if this, then that, either this, or that, and depending on which one you choose, then some other things, versus saying, go to bed early, get up early.
I think that is so important and so powerful, really, this kind of perspective shift of like, hey, give people like a general idea, right? But then every person listening to this has to tailor everything that we talk about to their own lives. And I think I was talking to Dr. Art Markman yesterday. We were talking about learning, right? And he said after every show, for example, that you listen to, every person should really take down a piece of paper, right? And write down like, what is it that I can apply to my life, right? Because everyone can pick up different things from this podcast, but how can I apply this directly to my life? Like, how can I make this my own? So I think that's such a great point you're making here.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what would we say what's the biggest lesson that you've learned from positive psychology?
Well, that's a tough one.
For sure.
There's so many amazing lessons I've learned.
Or just a great one thing that you believe would help other people improve their lives, or just helped you improve your life.
I think one of the best ones that I've discovered is that almost nothing is set in stone.
What do you mean by that?
That we often are a lot more empowered and we have a lot more power to change our situations than we think. And a lot of it is in how we look at it. And it's something along the lines of like, you cannot discount the role of luck, but you also cannot discount the role of personal effort. And I don't mean effort in terms of just elbow grease. I'm talking about what you choose to do, what you choose to look at, seeing the element of choice. And part of what I've come to see is that often we don't realize we have choices, and we don't see the array of choices that are available to us. But actually, once we do, we're in much better positions. And just the recognition that you've got the choice, especially when you don't think you have one, is probably one of the most empowering things. And I'm not about to sit here and say, we always have choices all the time. If somebody puts a gun to your head and tells you to do something, nominally you have the choice not to, but that's not realistic.
Yeah.
Right? But oftentimes we find ourselves feeling like we're stuck in situations and we don't realize we have a choice. And often there's a value to sitting back and saying, are these really the only options I've got? And are these really the only resources available to me? Coming up with the what ifs, getting friends involved, getting feedback from third parties, neutral parties that may be able to give us different information, as uncomfortable as that is going to be. And I'd say the other big lesson I learned from positive psych along those lines is that you're not supposed to be happy all the time. That's silly.
You gotta dive deeper in that.
I'm sorry?
You gotta dive deeper into that. Explain that, please.
Oh yeah, people are looking to be, have positive experiences all the time, get in flow all the time. First of all, you don't have enough energy to be in flow all the time. Flow is something that requires a lot of personal energy. You need a lot, and you got to put in a lot to experience flow. You can't do that all day. It's the same thing for positivity. We actually need that contrast. And in fact, negative emotions can be quite useful. Not that they're fun, not that they're enjoyable, but they're very useful and they can do a lot of things for us. I mean, emotions, I happen to subscribe to the theory, and different researchers, different opinions on this, but I subscribe to the theory that emotions are indicators of action, right? The way you feel is meant to drive you to action in some particular way. You feel guilty, it means you're driven to fix things. You feel sad, you're driven to recognize loss. and to take steps to recognize loss and appreciate things. Anger is an indicator that you are hurt. Pain is a warning that, something isn't quite right. Pain is a warning that, things aren't 100% and you need to start investigating. So pain is the indicator to investigate. And when we see emotions as a call to action, they have their uses. Now, obviously, negative emotions all the time, not so good either. But a proper balance, for instance, if we look at food, we don't say that all food has to taste good, especially some of the stuff that's good for us is not necessarily stuff that we absolutely love eating and would choose, given the option all the time. But we also know that healthy eating is a really important thing. So we got to eat some things that taste bitter. And after a while, if you really work it right, you can find perhaps not an enjoyment of the bitterness, but perhaps an appreciation of the bitterness in contrast with some of the other things that you might eat.
Wow, that is so interesting, of looking at negative emotions in this way of like, hey, this tells me, basically it tells you to act, right? It tells you that something in your life isn't going the way you want it to be. And so it forces you to act and to change something. That's so interesting. But so I think many people actually struggle not with having enough negative emotions. In fact, they have too many negative emotions. They can't quite get themselves to feel positive in their lives. They kind of feel overwhelmed. They feel stressed out and anxious all the time. So do you have any strategies you can suggest for people that just need to kind of change their balance towards the more positive?
You're not going to like this, but my answer to that starts with give yourself permission to be happy. Turns out to be a much harder task. I found this over and over that when I give people this advice, have you given yourself permission to be happy? Are you allowed to be happy? And you might be shocked to discover how often the answer is no. I don't have permission to be happy, because happiness is for silly people. Happiness is for stupid people. Happiness means I'm not working hard enough, or I'm not making the right contribution, or I'm completely ignoring how difficult life is for so many other people. And I'm not saying that somebody who is happy all the time, that might be a bit of a problem. Somebody who is constantly turning a blind eye to the human condition, yes, that's a problem. At the same time, no, just because you're not cognizant of the human condition and some of the terrible and horrific things that are happening in the world right now 100% of the time does not make you a bad person. And focusing on yourself a little bit does not make you selfish. And taking care of yourself, enlightens self-interest in this sense. Taking care of yourself so that you can make the fullest contribution possible to the world around you, to create a legacy that you value and that expresses your existence and your own meaning, and doing things that are good along the axes of value that you consider good, are certainly important things. But in order to do that, you actually have to take care of yourself, and you have to be yourself. And I tell you all this because when people are constantly experiencing negative emotions, often it's because they don't feel like they're allowed to be who they are. And that if they're doing something the way that they believe that they should, that they're just going to be ostracized, or there's going to be, their own personal voices in their heads that they've, ingested somewhere, telling them that they're bad people or they're not good enough people because they're not doing what perfect people do. As a point of interest, we're all flawed creations, but we do our best. And we're still going up the ladder. We're still trying to broaden and build. We're still trying to develop. We're still trying to increase our maturity, our complexity, and the day that we stop doing that is effectively, the day that they nail a wooden box around us and, bury us 6 feet deep.
That is so true. Wow, I love that. No, I think that's such an important point, that like you don't have to be perfect, but you can always give yourself this permission to be happy, to choose to be happy, right? It's effectively, it's a choice, right? Of like, what do you want to focus on? Like, do you want to, keep a gratitude journal, or like do things that are going to make you happy? And I think many people, even some of my coaching clients, they struggle with just all the demands that other people place on them, and they never really feel like they can own their own life. They never really feel like they're in charge. So I think that's so important, just choosing to be happy, giving yourself that permission.
Well, once again, I would not say it's choosing to be happy. Giving yourself permission isn't choosing to be happy. Giving yourself permission is the start of choosing to be happy.
Okay, I see that. All right, so you call yourself a self-actualization engineer. What do you mean by that?
So I'm very interested in the mechanisms of self-actualization and looking at how the pieces interact, trying to figure out, one of my life's goals, make it or not, but I'm going for it anyway, is coming up with a more detailed algorithm for self-actualization than Maslow's hierarchy.
Wow, okay. What a goal.
Either I'll make it or die trying.
Yeah, I mean, that's amazing. That's amazing. I
hope I'll make some progress. Whether I make it or not, I really hope I make some progress for, the next generation. And that, I should also point out that if you're going to have that pretentious of a goal, you better be laughing about it at least a little. And I am. But it's still something that really matters a lot to me because, working as a professor, going out in the world, consulting for companies, doing HR consulting, diversity consulting, coaching clients, throughout this entire process, one of the things that I've seen is not only are people not living up to what they consider to be their potential, they don't know how, they don't even necessarily know why they should, and many of them certainly don't feel like they have permission either from themselves and or from the world or both to actually do their best, be their best, and make their maximal contribution to society and to their lives and to their legacies and to the things that they hold dear. They don't necessarily feel like that's an option, or that, it should be an option, but there are way too many blocks in the way, but for this, but for that. And somehow I think that self-actualization is something that we could all get to, or at least it's something we can all pursue. And, I really do believe that it is a drive, as much a drive as food or water, that, given the freedom to do so, and this is really a tenet of humanistic psychology, that given the freedom to do so, all human beings will pursue self-actualization. And the question is, where are the blocks, and are they being denied that freedom in some way or another? And in many cases, we do this to ourselves. But how do we do it? What are the mechanisms? What are the variables? How can we tinker with the systems of living and of the world around us to basically make this system work for ourselves, for the people around us, for the societies that we value, for all the things that we appreciate? How can we make self-actualization work as, for lack of a better term, a machine or a system? And so to me, this looks a lot like engineering. And I studied a little bit of engineering. I've worked with a bunch of engineers, very awesome people, by the way. And like learning to think mechanistically, systematically, doing computational neuroscience as an undergrad, all gave me this notion of algorithms and systems that I really wanted to apply to psychology. And so, to me, I sometimes joke that a psychologist is a human engineer. We work on these machines called humans. We figure out the mechanisms, we figure out the rules, the equations, how it all works. And sure, that's an oversimplification, but I still think it's an interesting and useful model.
Oh, it is for sure. It is. I was actually taking what is it called? The kind of robot psychology, right? I'm liking the term right now, but kind of like machine learning, things like that. And that was really an interesting way of looking at it, like at the human brain, right? As like kind of like this whole response thing. So I know, you obviously still have a long way to go in kind of creating this model, but what do you think are going to be some of the mechanisms that we can use to achieve self-actualization?
I've mentioned a bunch of them already, actually. I'm finding that, one of the first things you have to do, and this is true in a whole lot of mathematical models, engineering models, and so on, is understanding the initial conditions. And often the results of the model depend very much upon the initial conditions. And so, we don't often look at what our initial conditions are. When we plug ourselves into these self-actualization models, if we do it without self-knowledge, then we don't have the initial conditions understood. So we have no idea where the model would take us.
Well, so first try figure out where you are right now in your life, and then kind of where you want to go and plot that course. Is that what you mean?
Not just, but where you are is not just a location thing. And I think that's important to keep in mind. It's not about your location per se, or not even just the conditions of your life, but also those things like preferences, values, things along those lines. I mean, just for one, example is, what is your idea of a good time? Cross-culturally, these things are very, very different. A German's idea of a good time may or may not be an American's idea of a good time, which may or may not be a Cambodian idea of a good time, which may or may not be a Lesotho idea of a good time. Like, each of those places has, different notions, different values, different cultures, and we learn from those, we adapt from those. And, in some cases we internalize it, in other cases we reject it, in other cases, we slide in different directions, in response to it. And I mean, like one of the jokes is that, for, certain cultures run late, certain cultures run very much on time.
German culture, oh God.
Right, so what would happen if you were born into a culture that is used to running late, but you grew up in Germany?
Yeah.
Where punctuality is a thing.
You'd be like 10 minutes early every time.
Exactly, and yet, you come from a culture where everybody's late. Now, how does that mix? So what some people will do is they'll reject the German aspect of it, keep their own personal culture. Others will say, I love my personal culture, but this whole lack of punctuality really is bothering me. I like the way the Germans do this, and they're always on time, and I love that. So, hey, great. But, some of that even has to do with your time style, whether you're a Chronos or a Kairos, or, whether you do clock time or event time. It happens, I'm an event time person. So, if something starts a little bit late, it doesn't always bother me as much. And if something runs late, it doesn't bother me as much as, let's say, one of my parents happens to be a clock time person. And, for that parent, things have to be at this time. And, ironically, not a parent of German descent, but still has that, like, would fit in very well in Germany on that particular point.
Oh, that sounds like it, yeah.
And yet the other one of my parents is basically event time. And I follow that parent, and like, an event time parent who, fits in very well with that culture. And so it's, growing up with one parent who's clock time, one parent who's event time, I kind of had to figure out what my preferences were. Because when I'm with one parent, I'm really finding myself on clock time. When I'm with the other parent, I find myself on event time. Well, which one of those am I?
Oh, yeah.
And over time, I learned that I really am listen, there's some clock time and event time in all of us. And we both have that. But, which one do we use more often? I found that most of the time, I'm an event time person. And it's not that I can't freak out about somebody being late, or I can't freak out about being late myself. Or, at one point, when I was in Singapore and I had, business meetings in Singapore, believe me when I tell you, I was 5 minutes early to every meeting in Singapore. But, and in America, I'm not necessarily 5 minutes early to every meeting, but, it's, when in Rome, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, it's very interesting how culture really plays a role in like how we behave, right? And all of a sudden, like we moved to another country, like I studied in the US for the last 3 years, and things are different there, right? Like, you interact with people in a different way. You basically become another person. Like you become much more cheerful. For example, when I went to the US, I was much more cheerful than when I'm talking to people here in Germany, which is really weird because you actually change kind of like who you are in a certain way to kind of adapt to the culture.
And funnily enough, let me give you the opposite side of that, because my experience with Germans is that really it takes Germans a lot longer to warm up to you.
Oh, for sure.
Americans warm up very quickly, and so Americans, especially depending on where you go, Americans seem a lot more friendly than Germans because they warm up. They just warm up to people quickly. It's just a cultural thing that you warm up quickly, at least to superficial levels. Whereas most of my German colleagues, very cool people, but it takes them a while to break the ice, to melt the ice. You have to have a beer first, and then things start rolling. I'm sorry?
You have to have a beer first, and then things start rolling there. So,
yes, but then also, I found that I've had some very deep and strong relationships with German colleagues. As the ice breaks, it just takes longer to build. But in that sense, they're still very valuable relationships. It's just understanding that the dynamics of it are going to be a little bit different. And my German colleagues and I compare notes about what it is to be doing German social structure versus American social structure. because, in the US, you don't always know, because you've got fun, casual conversations with all sorts of people, but do you know whether you can count on them?
Yeah, that's true.
Whereas in Germany, that's less of a question, I find.
Yeah. That's exactly my experience. So it's really interesting, like moving to other cultures and really seeing those differences.
Yeah, spending a month in China was quite eye-opening for me.
Oh wow, what were some key insights from that?
There were so many, but like one of the things that I found was really interesting is that the way that the Chinese do diplomacy and tact, they have a very different way of being tactful and diplomatic, which first of all took some getting used to, but also second of all was very impressive to me. Like the way that there's so much subtlety conveyed in the language and in conversation and in body language. It's extremely subtle. There are a lot of cues that are there. And I thought that was a really interesting and very different way of communicating from many of the Western styles. And so watching that, adapting to that, learning all of that, and I barely scratched the surface on that. So I feel like I know so little about it, and yet those differences really jumped out at me. And I think that says a lot about the differences in the way that people communicate and in the way that people establish themselves and what they want to say and how they relate to people. How we express that seems to be very different in China versus in the US. And it was some culture shock. There was quite a bit of culture shock for me because, I'm very, especially I grew up in the Metro New York area. So, I'm a fast-talking, plain-spoken New Yorker.
That's totally different, yeah.
I'm sorry?
That is totally different, the culture there, I believe that.
Yeah, and funnily enough, I teach a lot of students from China in New York, and, they also have a lot of the same culture shock. Coming to New York and finding all these straight-up, plain-spoken people, but yet at the same time, people say that New Yorkers are not so friendly. It's a cultural thing. This is just such a big, crowded city that you just can't.
You almost become rude, right? Like you just become like aggressive and like want to just push through.
It is, but but being able to appreciate those differences and seeing those differences is really eye-opening because it gives you the opportunity to see and learn from another style, and then see what of that may make sense to you in some very deep ways, like diplomacy. New Yorkers, not always so diplomatic. And, and some people think that's a good thing. Some people think that's a bad thing. One thing I do appreciate about New Yorkers is that you always know where you stand with them.
Oh, that's true.
Even if it means that they're telling you to flip off, at least you know how they feel. And like it's genuine. Authenticity is a much stronger value in New York. Authenticity of expression, authenticity of self. And so, yeah, if we don't like you, we're going to tell you where to go, and it's not going to be the ball game.
that is very true. And I think that leads us to another point, and that is like our personalities even are so flexible at times, right? Like we can adapt to virtually like any circumstances, any people around us, whatever, right? So I think one of the takeaways from that is that like also if we want to change ourselves, like putting ourselves in different situations, even in the same kind of city, right? Like seeking out new friend circles or seeking out new environments can actually change who we are for the better. What do you think about that?
I think there's a lot of truth to that, but I also think that one of the most important things to keep in mind is that it's more of a tasting menu than it is a new method.
What do you mean by that?
Still in all, you've got your own set of preferences, values, ideas, and your own experiences. And, when you start hanging out with other people, when you start, changing your circumstances, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to change you completely. Oh, but what it does mean is that it gives you opportunities to change.
Okay.
But people think of change. I mean, change is an inevitable thing, but how much change is not inevitable.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it always comes down to person, right? Like to what you're actually doing. I was just meant if you put yourself in this situation, it's probably going to act as like a facilitator, basically, right? It makes things easier, even if not effortless, right? So
yeah, it's a catalyst.
Exactly. That's what you mentioned in your TED talk, right?
Yeah.
It acts as a catalyst. I love that. So let's get a little more personal here. So in the last 5 years, what new belief, behavior, habit has improved your life the most?
Hmm. Over the years, I've gotten a lot better at trusting myself.
Trusting, what do you mean? Your first instincts or?
Trusting my instincts, trusting my experience, trusting my gut, and that's been a real struggle because as a scientist, you're very much a positivist, you're a rationalist. You wanna appreciate the data. And over the years, I've really come to learn that as important as the data are, there is also a value to wisdom and experience. And this is a lesson I definitely got from my parents, which I really appreciate them teaching me. And from a very young age, they really emphasized that there is a difference between being smart and being wise, and they're not the same thing.
What do you think is the difference?
And again, I'm drawing a first approximation and not a research-based response, but I find that being smart is about what you know, sorts of intellectual gymnastics that you can make, but I think that wisdom is more about knowing the difference between good and bad information. Mm-hmm. Smart means you know the information. Wisdom means you know whether it's good or bad. And you're a more intelligent consumer of the information, and more importantly, you know when to use which bit of information. Because there's lots of conflicting information out there, but when do you use which? And when is each piece of knowledge applicable or true, or knowing when to apply which knowledge to which situations? I think that's where wisdom really comes in, and that's where over time you learn to trust yourself and recognize that you have built experiences. And trusting yourself doesn't mean you trust yourself completely, or that you don't worry about your own biases. You do. Yeah. But I know that personally I've listed too much to the side of doubting myself, and I still remember a conversation I had with Csikszentmihalyi about this. He gave me a lot of encouragement because I had a lot of doubts, I had a lot of worries. I think that this is something that everybody who goes to grad school does, because grad school definitely beats the heck out of whatever ego you may have walked in with.
I believe that. Right. I'm standing right in front of that, starting my master's now. So.
Yeah. So Csikszentmihalyi also, both Csikszentmihalyi and Nakamura also both did a great job of, trying to help build me up, and remind myself that yes, you know what you're doing. You have experience, you have a track record. And, looking at the track record of your successes and trusting that, given that you have that track record, that you're likely to continue on that path. It's not a guarantee, but it's likely.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think we're all, like, whenever we come into a new situation or environment, we all have this kind of imposter syndrome, right? Where we think, like, I'm not good enough, like all the other people are just so much smarter, so much better. And so I love what you're saying here about really looking at your track record, looking at all the amazing things that you've done, and realizing that, like, hey, so far I've succeeded, I've done this well, I've done that well. And so I'm most likely going to keep doing that, right? I'm most likely going to keep succeeding, right? I love that.
Yeah, I'll also add to this, that for some of my students, I found that one of the most interesting conversations that I have with them occurs when we talk about how they've been successful in my class. They'll say that they don't think of themselves as being that competent or whatever, and I'll point to the list of successes that they've had in my class. Times when they've done something really, really brilliant or really helpful or really clever, and they're often shocked to notice how much they've contributed.
Yeah.
And I think of an example. This past semester, I had this one student who constantly was telling me that his work wasn't that good, that he's not sure he's that bright, and so on and so on. And yet, that more than once, I think it was 3 separate times during the semester, I had the entire class stumped on something, and he just raises his hand and he's like, I don't know, but is it like this? And it was right on the money.
Wow.
Consistently, the entire class is stumped. He raises his hand, ventures this thing, and he's right on. And it, you do that once, you're lucky. You do that twice, maybe you're just really lucky.
Yeah.
But, at a certain point, I've just got to say, this is a really good, the rest of the class has been stumped and you got it 3 times. I'm not willing to let you, accept all of these doubts right now.
Yeah, that's very true. And I think we're always our worst critic, right? Like, I think we always tend to look for only the negatives, only the times when, like, maybe we'd said something wrong. And we don't acknowledge, actually, all the amazing things we've done in our lives. So
I think we're afraid to, and I think we're trained not to.
By the school system, or by where do you think that comes from?
Well, one of the things that I found increasingly is that people seem to think that humility requires you to be self-effacing.
Yeah.
Whereas I would say that humility requires you to be honest about yourself and about your abilities. And that means when you know, it's not arrogant to know when you know and to say that you know when you know. And it's also not arrogant to say that you're good at something when you are. I think it's kind of ridiculous if you're good at something and you're not going to and you're going to hide that. I don't see what service you're doing anybody. I don't see what value you're providing.
Yeah, that's right. So it's really about finding the kind of balance between, like, hey, do I actually know this? Do I not? And then, like, being willing to step up, right? Like, if you know something, being willing to step up and actually volunteer that.
Right, and it's recognizing that to those to whom much is given, from them much is expected also. Right? I mean, what's funny is those who haven't been given much in this world, funnily enough, we don't actually have that many obligations. We don't obligate them to do so many things. We don't hold them responsible for nearly as much. Whereas, those of us who have received a great deal, we hold those folks responsible way more than we do other people. And there is a responsibility for those who have that great, those great talents, those great resources, whatever they are. We often hold them responsible, and we expect more of them, and we demand more of them.
That is definitely true. Yeah, that's definitely true. So before I dive into my final question, one final question is, for anyone starting out in coaching and consulting, do you have any advice on how to kind of start their career? Because I know you have a lot of experience over the years, so any piece of advice?
I think the first one is start looking for the patterns of where people find you uniquely valuable. I mean, the way I became a coach and a consultant and a startup advisor, like in all these cases, people ask me, how did that happen? And my answer was, people had questions, I had answers, and they seemed to like my answers. That's how it started. I was a scientist. I was just doing science. I liked application and I had work experience. And, I started doing work and, doing, full-time summer jobs, even in high school and, working corporate and, having all these experiences. But, really it was people had questions, I had answers, and they liked them. And, over time, it really became like, well, I should probably be charging money to answer these questions.
Yeah, right. Actually use that skill, yeah.
And providing, well, also because I was providing more in-depth answers. When people have a quick question for me, like that's usually not the sort of thing that I'm looking to charge for. But at the same time, it's like a more in-depth answer that you're taking a lot of my time with an in-depth answer.
That's true.
So yeah, I need to put food on my table, a roof over my head, all that sort of thing. So yeah, I'm much more likely to want to charge people for that time. But that's really how it came about.
Yeah, I love that. So before I ask my final question, where can people connect with you online?
So I'm on LinkedIn. And I have my own website, QLLAB.org. QLLab.org is my website, and it shows how to contact me. And people can also look at my blog on Medium. It's Dr. Orin Davis, ORINDAVIS. So you can check out my blog, which is also linked from my website. And links to almost everything are from the QLLab.org site. You can find my Tedx talk. You can find more about my consulting and coaching practices, startup advising practices, and also my teaching and some of the other work that I'm doing.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, I'll definitely put up the links there as well on my blog. So final question, what does mental mastery mean to you?
I think mental mastery is knowing your own personal mechanisms. It's knowing how you work, knowing how your mind works, and knowing how to affect each of those variables or each of those switches, and knowing what does and does not affect those things. And then being able to react and respond and do the best that you can to create the conditions that will in turn lead to what you want things to be, with perfect recognition that that is not going to work out well or perfectly all the time, but that you have the ability to optimize, and optimization can be, relative, but that you have the wherewithal and understanding of yourself, the way you work, and how the environment affects you to pull whatever levers, to look for the right resources to create that optimized situation for yourself.
Awesome, love that. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. And thank you to everyone who tuned in to today's episode of Mental Mastery. Tune in daily for new episodes on how you can achieve mental mastery and live a happy and successful life. And if you would like a little extra push, head over to my website maxweigand.com for a free ebook on mastering self-discipline and willpower. There, you can also sign up for my one-on-one habit coaching program where I help you master your habits and achieve your goals. Also, if you like this interview, feel free to rate and review the show. Until next time,